All right, welcome back, everybody. We're in week 3, and so we're going to start doing the geology heavy unit of the class. A reminder that we did not have a new lecture on Monday, and we'll be transitioning from climate to a more geology-centric unit. If you are a geology major who's already taken Earth 2, some of this stuff might be familiar because we'll be covering some of the same physical geology concepts like plate boundaries and, of course, plate tectonics. If this is your first time coming across this is something I'm very happy to elaborate more on outside of class because there is some material that I will be skimming over quite a bit. So the first half of today's lecture will introduce the topic of plate tectonics and go over the theory, while the second half will move on to the different types of boundaries between tectonic plates, and I'll bring in Antarctica to do that, to talk about different plate boundaries around Antarctica. So this week, there is a lab on ocean currents due on Friday. Please read the slides provided by your TAs first, because those will be very helpful. And I highly recommend attending their office hour sessions if you can, and especially if you get a chance, if you look at the lab and end up having trouble with it. There is also one of the lecture quizzes due this week. So we will only have 2 of those, and remember that those are separate from the labs. The lecture quiz is on material from weeks 1 and 2. So this lecture number 5, is not included on it at all. And I will be posting the review session from Wednesday, January 20th, which will go over some of the information from the quiz. There is also a cool extra credit opportunity this week. We have a colloquium where a visiting professor is going to talk about his research that tries to link the land more to the research, and especially in the context of the people and the indigenous people who've lived there. So I think it's an interesting interdisciplinary topic, and it might be a fun thing to write about if you're looking for something that's a bit more science and society focused. So that happens Thursday, January 21st at 2 o'clock. So we're not going to talk about Jar Jar Binks. I just watched Star Wars again recently. But today we will very briefly go over how Earth is structured physically, not chemically so much. And I'm going to be skimming over a lot of how we know about how Earth is structured, and a lot about different chemical layers of the Earth we will just barely go over. The main reason I will do the overview of the physical layers is to introduce the concept of plate tectonics, because to know what I mean by plates, you need to know a little bit about how physically the Earth is broken up, because the Earth has layers. We will also then talk about how a separate but related theory, continental drift, first led to the development of the theory of plate tectonics. And continental drift is all about thinking about the fact that were the continents always where they are now, which is a topic I've brought up before, because as we know now, Antarctica has not always been quite as far south as it's been. It's not always been as far away from the other continents as it's been either. And the theory of continental drift eventually led to the discovery of plate tectonics once technology improved. The second half of the lecture will focus more on the driving forces of plate tectonics, as well as the different types of boundaries between tectonic plates, because those different types are important, and how those different examples show up around Antarctica. So let's talk about physical layers of the Earth. We know today that the Earth is made of different layers, and one unfortunately confusing aspect is that the layers can be defined differently depending on whether you want to talk about chemistry, aka how much silica is in the rock versus how much iron is in the rock, or physics. And when I say physics, I mean if the layer is a solid or a liquid, and if it's a solid, how it's behaving. So we'll mostly be talking physical layers because that's more important for understanding plate tectonics. So a solid can actually, different solid objects can behave differently when put under stress. A rock or a brick, if you pull it hard enough or if you smash it, it will bend until it can't break anymore, and then it will break. But some solids don't really do this so much if you put pressure on them. Some solids deform plastically, and they're considered to be plastic solids. So silly putty is fun because you can twist silly putty and pull it and push it into weird shapes without it breaking, at least up to a point. And it turns out that different layers of the Earth physically, some act like, well, solid rock, because that's what they are, but some act a lot more like silly putty. There are actually significant large layers of the Earth that flow like silly putty. So the one part of it actually is that the warmer a solid is, the more it can deform. You can heat up a solid enough so that it's not quite a liquid yet. It doesn't flow quite as much as a liquid, but it still is going to flow. And this is a concept we'll come back to with glaciers also. Glaciers are a good example of a solid that flows. So the uppermost two physical layers of the Earth are the lithosphere and the asthenosphere. The lithosphere is a rigid solid that will bend and break under stress, and the asthenosphere is a plastic solid that flows. And it turns out the lithosphere floats on top of the asthenosphere. Something I want to mention is that you'll see the terms crust and mantle, and those actually refer to differences in chemistry. The lithosphere actually includes the crust as well as the uppermost part of the mantle. However, as you go down in the mantle, it starts to behave more plastically, and even though the asthenosphere chemically is the same as the part of the mantle that's in the lithosphere, it physically behaves completely differently. So the crust is chemically the outermost layer of Earth, and it's kind of like pond scum floating on top because it's less dense than anything else. It's chemically less dense because it has so much silica and so little iron. And if you look at the periodic table, silica is a much lighter element than iron, and it really comes down to that. The core, in fact, is defined by mostly having iron and nickel and very little silica. Something else we'll talk about is that crust can be divided into either oceanic crust or continental crust. The oceanic crust is that which underlies the oceans, and continental crust is what we are walking on. Something you might find a bit strange and counterintuitive is that oceanic crust does not actually oceanic crust does not form because the ocean is there. Rather, the ocean ends up where it is because oceanic crust forms there. Does that seem weird? We'll come back to that one. Don't worry. But regardless of whether you have oceanic or continental crust, it's very thin. It's floating on top of the mantle. However, it turns out that the crust is joined with the uppermost part of the mantle. So you have crust kind of dragging along the uppermost part of the mantle with it, floating on top of the asthenosphere. And the tectonic plates, it turns out, consist of pieces of the lithosphere floating along the asthenosphere and dragging along. So in this diagram, I'll show you what I mean by a plate. Let's see where I can put myself. The dots in this diagram are actually earthquakes, and the triangles are volcanoes. And we'll come back to that, actually, how it's not a coincidence that you have most earthquakes and volcanoes in the world happen at plate boundaries. But this is a piece of Earth's lithosphere, the crust on which Antarctica and the surrounding ocean sits, and then a little bit of mantle underneath it. And these are other pieces of lithosphere, and they're floating underneath this is the asthenosphere, and that's what they're floating on. So Antarctica sits on the Antarctic plate. Antarctica is what is known as a craton, which is something we'll come back to next week. And a craton is a piece of lithosphere that has remained relatively stable throughout geologic history. Now, it's not always been in the same place. It's not always been quite as close to the South Pole, and it's also been attached to other continents, whereas now it's not at all. So there is also a craton underlying the South American plate, which is nearby, and the South American plate is one of the other major plates. You'll also notice there's a lot of places where there's a bunch of little dots, and there's kind of a weird squiggly line here. If you look to this other diagram, you'll notice that there are some lines defined by island chains and by these colors around what are called microplates. Earth has large plates as well as smaller plates whose motion is pretty much defined by the larger plates movement, but they kind of come and go as a result of movement of larger plates. And a concept that I want to introduce is that the plates as they look today, they haven't always exactly looked like that. There are new plates form, plates can be destroyed, plates can cease to exist, plates can merge. We'll not talk about it a lot in this class, but Earth's surface is very dynamic. Anyhow, Antarctica is mostly on just the Antarctic plate, but some of the surrounding subantarctic islands are actually formed at the boundary between the Antarctic plate and the surrounding microplates, or between microplates like the Scotia or the Sandwich Plate and South America. So, plate tectonics, the unifying theory of geology, is a pretty darn young theory. My grandma is 79, and she took one geology class in college before plate tectonics was taught as established fact. Now, it can kind of seem simplistic. The Earth's surface is just broken into rigid plates. Those rigid plates move in relation to each other on top of the floating asthenosphere, and the vast majority of earthquakes, volcanoes, and other geologic processes happen as a result of this. So, to understand volcanoes, you need to understand plate tectonics. To understand topography, because that relies on where mountains are, it helps to understand plate tectonics. To understand earthquakes, you need to understand plate tectonics. And the the cool thing, like I mentioned before, is that the locations of earthquakes and volcanoes does a really good job of showing plate boundaries. It shows that with a very few small exceptions, like some I'll talk about, you get volcanoes at plate boundaries. And I am not going to have much time in this class to give you the full version of how exactly we got from assuming that the Earth has always looked like this to knowing that in fact it's made of different pieces that are all moving in different directions relative to each other, and that, for example, South America and Africa were once joined, and that Antarctica and Australia only very recently became separate continents. But I'll give you the short version. And this is something I do know quite a bit about and find very fascinating, so I'm very happy to talk about it outside of this. But but we can't talk about plate tectonics without at least briefly talking about the theory of continental drift, which sort of states part of the theory of plate tectonics but doesn't really go all the way. It says the continents on Earth have moved. They have not always been in the position that we see them today. They could possibly have been very, very elsewhere. And it's a key aspect of plate tectonics, but it's not the whole story because it doesn't say how or why this happens. And it's also very continent centric. The key thing is that it doesn't really talk about the oceans much. And as we'll find out later, once we could go under the ocean more, we could actually get a better understanding of plate tectonics because you need to understand oceanic crust. So the first person to publish the idea of continental drift was a German scientist named Alfred Wegener, and he referred to it as die Wischerberg der Kontinent, the displacement of the continents or the dance of the continents, which I find kind of delightful. And he basically there's a lot of things that are wrong with this picture. He noticed 4 bits of evidence that seem to suggest that it does not make sense for South America always to have been in the tropics mostly, or for Antarctica to have always been isolated and at the South Pole. The bits of evidence were fossils of the same plant or animal found on different sides of an ocean, the fact that some of the continents simply look like they should fit together, and yes, that is literally what he put in his paper, the fact that they found evidence of glaciers near the equator, and the alignment of mountain belts across the oceans. A lot of this is going to come down to either the Atlantic Ocean or the Southern Ocean. So let's go to the first of those, fossils. So remember that a fossil is just evidence of an extinct organism, a plant, a fungus, an animal. Organism is just a general term for that. And when Wegener was alive, the fossil spree had really hit full steam. People were digging up fossils all over the place. They didn't necessarily know what to make of them, though. They were finding extinct animals that sort of flew in the face of the idea that Earth had been formed recently and that everything that exists now has existed always. That's not true. So they started finding fossils, and they started finding fossils whose locations didn't make sense. As in, this animal is Lystrosaurus, which is actually, it looks kind of like a hippopotamus dinosaur. It's closer to a mammal. It's actually pretty closely related to us, much more than dinosaurs. Lystrosaurus, they have found in Antarctica, they have found in Africa, and I believe India as well, since this was published. And Lystrosaurus is not the only example of animals they found. There is a little reptile called Mesosaurus, which was a swimming reptile, but it swam in swamps, that they have found in both Brazil and in Western Africa. And there's also plants that they've found in Australia, Antarctica, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and South America. This same plant species, Glossopteris, that it turns out was the main forest plant in much of the South during the period right before the age of dinosaurs. So a couple of things going on here. For one thing, none of these could have swum. I mean, Glossopteris could have been distributed by the wind, but it's kind of a long shot. And why India also? Why India and not the rest of Asia? There's plants found all over the place, and then there's these animals that clearly could not have swum across an ocean. This thing was not a whale. This thing could not have swum across an ocean. found on either sides of what are today modern oceans that we don't expect animals like this to be able to cross. Um, so that's one thing. The other thing is that what the heck are forest plants doing in Antarctica? What the heck are these hippopotamus animals doing in Antarctica? What the heck are this animal is an amphibian, a large extinct species of amphibian that lived in, well, actually we'll see one in the Walking with Dinosaurs episode I'm going to have you watch. But amphibians don't live in Antarctica today. So they found fossils of things in Antarctica that clearly could not have survived in modern Antarctica. So the fossils give you a sense that the continents might have separated and that they might not be at the same latitude that they are now. And this is a diagram we'll come back to. You'll see this in lab. This diagram gives you a sense of, now that scientists know that this is what much of the southern hemisphere was coordinated as during the dinosaur age and before, this is kind of how this shows how they've actually used where fossils are located to reconstruct where continents were, not the other way around. Because they found animals on either side of an ocean that clearly could not have swum across an ocean, so naturally when these animals were alive, there was no ocean. And same with many of the Antarctic and Australian fossils. Lystrosaurus, which is found in India, Antarctica, and Africa, which are nowhere near each other, but you can piece them back together. You can see how scientists have recreated where these fossils were found. You can also see Madagascar is in the middle of this. Madagascar used to be sandwiched between India and Africa, and there's people from our department who've done work in Madagascar looking at that. But you noticed how Africa and South America, so I really love the second bit of evidence because it feels like it's something that I noticed when I was a kid. I noticed that Africa and South America look like they should fit together, and that's kind of what Wegener noticed too after staring at maps. He and other people who shared his observations thought that they looked too similar for it to be a coincidence. And the fun thing here is that if you look closely at the picture, this is a Google Earth image, and you can see the mid-ocean ridge. You can see the texture of the feature that would later explain how this happened. The key thing is that Wegener didn't know this existed. The mid-ocean ridge had not been discovered yet. Nobody had really gone deep into the Atlantic Ocean. It was just a body of water. They weren't really considering what might be happening under the ocean to make this happen. And that was, it turned out, a big reason why he never came up with a mechanism. But in hindsight, we can see, oh, there's actually this zigzaggy thing running down the middle, and that turns out that's the underwater volcano that is actually separating the continents. Number 3 is glaciers. Oops, excuse me. And the weird thing about glaciers is that you can find glaciers in places like South America today, but up in the mountains. Something we'll learn about the glaciers is that they leave a very telltale record. They polish the surfaces underneath them, so the rock actually looks kind of shiny. They grind up the rock into what's called glacial flour, extremely fine-grained rock that has the texture of flour. Or, yes, sediment that later becomes rock that you can still kind of discern this from. But occasionally glaciers will just pluck especially hardy rocks, and they'll carry them until they melt out in the ocean, and they will drop boulders out in the ocean sediments. This picture in the middle is an example of that. You've got these nice layers of ocean mud, and then just this, it looks like a giant dropped a marble into it, basically. And that's kind of what the glacier is doing. The glacier carries the rock and then drops it out over the ocean. So we see this happening today with glaciers, and scientists were examining rocks in Australia, India, South America, places where at sea level you don't have glaciers. And that's an important thing. Dropstones happen in places like Antarctica and Greenland today, where you have glaciers at sea level. So they found this in places where there are not glaciers at sea level today, which could indicate one of two things. Either that the climate was a lot colder then, which, yes, that could have been true, or that the continents have not always been at the same latitudes that they were before, because Antarctica has glaciers at sea level because of the latitude it's at least to a big degree. But let's say Antarctica had been at the equator at one point, and in fact, many, many, many years ago it was, you're not going to have glaciers there. But if say South America had been over the North Pole 700 millions of years ago, you would have evidence of glaciers there. And that's what they found. So I realize I'm kind of working backwards with the benefit of hindsight, but essentially finding dropstones and giant dropstones in glacial flour and polished surfaces in rocks in South America baffled people as much as finding fossils of ferns and ancient hippopotamus creatures in Antarctica. And the last bit is mostly actually related to a tidbit that you might have noticed from the animals slide, from the fossil slide. You might have noticed that there was an orange color underneath them that said rock types found, and fossils are found in rocks. In fact, fossils are often used to define rocks and identify rocks as being from a particular era, rather than the other way around, actually. So scientists, when they found these fossils of the same creatures on either sides of the ocean, they looked at the rock that they were in and discovered that the rocks were similar, too similar to have been coincidentally just deposited on either side of an ocean. Because rocks just kind of end up there. Sediment settles down, or a volcano drops a lava flow, and it doesn't really, you're not going to have the same feature on either side of an ocean. It just does not work that way. Kind of broadening from that, they didn't only just find the same type of rock, they found structures that were similar. They found mountains on either, they found that the chains of mountains on either side of the Atlantic, for example, had really similar structure. The Atlas Mountains and the Scottish Highlands and the Scandinavia highlands, in terms of the rock types, their structures, their orientation, and the models that came out of trying to figure out, okay, how did these form? It mirrored what you found on the eastern shore of Greenland and the Appalachian Mountains in North America, aka the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And this is something we'll also see in Antarctica, because as Antarctica became separated from its neighbors, you end up finding similar structures to ones in Antarctica all the way in South Africa, across an ocean now, but geologically speaking, only recently departed from Antarctica. And so fossils, the jigsaw puzzle fit, glaciers, and similar geologic structures gave a lot of compelling evidence to the idea that the continents had moved around, but his idea was kind of thrown out. Not completely, but it wasn't a big revelation to people, and it wasn't accepted as the truth, or the big revelation that it really actually was. And they were limited. Wegener and the other people working on this were limited by the science they had available. For one thing, they couldn't come up with a mechanism that made sense. When I say mechanism, I mean basically, what is causing this? What's doing this? Why did the continents move? And he couldn't come up with one. He suggested that it had to do with the fact that Earth is rotating, or that it's the pull of the moon or Mars or the sun on Earth's gravity. That one actually is slightly relevant because, as we'll find out, plate tectonics are driven by movement of material in the mantle, and that is actually affected by gravity. But we don't have a great understanding of how, and he didn't either, nor did he have a great idea of the idea of mantle convection. So he was onto something with that, but didn't have it, but not quite there. He also wasn't a geologist. He was a physicist, so nobody took him seriously. I think people still make that mistake, but I think it made people realize that actually sometimes really good observations in a field happen by people who not necessarily were immersed in that field to begin with. They might have outside observations, and he kind of did. And I think this underscores the importance of kind of a diverse set of backgrounds in tackling a problem, because different people observe different things. The mechanism would not be found for years. Wegener and the other people working on this did a lot of great work, but it turns out that we really had to be able to see what was underneath the oceans to know what was going on. I mentioned before that this pretty much all had to do with the continents. So what do the oceans have to do with it? Quite a lot, it turns out. Remember that we were curious about what was happening on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, I also pointed out the texture under the Atlantic Ocean to you, and that is a feature called the mid-ocean ridge. It is a relatively low, elongate mountain on the seafloor. It runs all the way from the Arctic Ocean to the Southern Ocean, and it is essentially a single, long, narrow volcano. It is one of the longest mountain chains in the world, and it is one of the longest volcanoes in the world. It is also, the one in the Atlantic is also not the only mid-ocean ridge. There are mid-ocean ridges in all of the oceans, including around Antarctica. It is one of the longest, though, and one of the easiest to trace along a single path. And nobody knew it existed until the early 20th century. They had developed sonar and improved submarine technology by this time, so they could physically go down further, and they could also see the seafloor by echoing sounds down to there. Also, it was the era of the World Wars, so European and American military boats were all over the Atlantic Ocean, and there were a lot of scientists and geologists on board, actually, because they were surveying the floor, trying to figure out, okay, are there undersea mountains that we might hit by accident? So, to some extent, plate tectonics is a side product of military technology, which is interesting to me and something I have to consider. Um, a geologist on board one of the ships identified that there was an underwater mountain chain, and this was a big shock because people thought the seafloor was featureless. Well, it actually wasn't, and there was stuff going down there. There was a volcano erupting down there, and a volcano erupting means new crust. Crust is formed by volcanoes erupting. And if you have a mid-ocean ridge producing volcanoes and crust in either direction, that's something called seafloor spreading. And here is an animation of seafloor spreading, actually by an emeritus professor here, Dr. Tanya Otwater. And her animations are linked in the course resources on Gaucho Space if you want to take a look through them, because they're quite cool and often do a really good job of illustrating the concepts well. So notice something. There is not just one vent. There are a couple of them, and they're staggered. Notice that crust is being produced on either side of the vent, and it's being made symmetrically. It's popping up at this one vent, but it's going out in either direction. New lava solidifies and cools to form rock and gets brought out, and then new magma gets brought up and solidifies, and this goes on and on and on. Something you'll want to pay attention to later is with the staggering, notice how the conveyor belts are moving in opposite directions on these little connector segments between the vents. That is a feature we'll talk about more heavily during the second half of this lecture. When people actually went down to the ocean floor, they discovered something interesting about the magnetic properties of the rocks. So scientists saw that lava was bubbling up, and the hypothesis was developed that lava was going out on either side and that it was symmetrical. They looked for evidence to support it, and they found quite a bit. One bit of evidence is related to Earth's magnetic field, in that Earth's magnetic field actually will cause little flecks of iron inside of the magma to point a certain direction. When the magma cools, it freezes the iron flecks in a particular orientation. Now, Earth's magnetic field flips periodically, and so when Earth's magnetic field flips completely, the iron is going to point in a different direction, but only if it's in magma. If the iron has already solidified in the solid cooled rock, it will retain its original orientation. So that's kind of what this stripy pattern is. The cooled rocks on either side of the spreading center have this record of first normal polarity and then reverse polarity and then normal and reversed on either side, because the orientation of the iron flecks gets preserved once the rock is cooled. It stays that way after the magma cools. So this pattern of what are called magnetic field reversals supported the idea that magma was being produced at the central vents and then spreading symmetrically. And this is another version of that same animation that shows how this is happening. You kind of see that there's either black or white being produced at the center. So white is normal, black is reversed. And you'll notice it changes at the center, and then that change gets reflected on the outside. It starts out black and then turns white, and you'll notice there's white stuff being pushed to either side. And then the field has reversed again, but very briefly, and then it goes back. But the briefness is reflected in that tiny strap on either side. You notice that, right? Even a tiny little blip reversal is reflected, because there's magma being produced all the time. And this is actually the two go hand in hand. People study Earth's magnetic field by looking at reversals in oceanic crust. They looked to see if there were other aspects that might support this on either side, and as expected, and supporting this hypothesis, the rocks on either side of the mid-ocean ridge were symmetrical as well. So Some rocks can be dated with radioactive decay. Rocks that form from volcanoes can be in particular. So what they can do is provide ages for how old these rocks are and correlate them on either side of the mid-ocean ridges. So what they found was that the rocks at the center, closest to the active volcano, were youngest, and that as you went away on either direction, the rocks got older and symmetrically, aka if you went 20 miles to the east from the center and 20 miles to the west from the center, the rocks would be the same age and also have the same magnetic properties. And the dating also confirmed that the oceanic crust wasn't that old. It confirms that something else has to happen to it if the Earth is going to be older than 200 million years, which is the age of the oldest oceanic crust. Something you want to look at in this diagram is that the youngest crust is colored red, and that's colored that way intentionally because the crust that's near the vent is warmer. The crust that is farther away from the vent is cooler because it has longer to cool. And as it gets colder, it gets denser, more compact, and it sinks more into the asthenosphere. As it turns out, that actually creates a gradient from the mid-ocean ridges away to the subduction zones, which are where the crust goes, and that gradient actually drives the movement of plate tectonics, at least in part. Now, I got a little bit ahead of myself with subduction. Subduction is what happens to crust, at least some types of crust, oceanic crust in particular. Oceanic crust is formed at spreading centers and it gets recycled at subduction zones. Either oceanic crust will come into contact with continental crust or with other oceanic crust. And in that case, the denser oceanic crust, aka the older crust, will be the one that sinks. And this is how oceanic crust is recycled and why the Earth doesn't just get bigger and bigger and bigger from seafloor spreading over time. The plate re-enters Earth at a trench like the Marianas Trench. That is, in fact, a subduction trench where oceanic crust is going under. And these trenches are found near volcanic arcs, like you find in the Cascades here, or in Japan, or in the subantarctic islands in Antarctica. The downgoing plate actually causes volcanic eruptions. And speaking of earthquakes and volcanoes, a bit of improved evidence and a tool that Alfred Wegener would have been very happy to have during his lifetime was the ability to map earthquakes as well as the records of where volcanoes have erupted and where active or potentially soon to be active volcanoes are. People realized that either you had earthquakes at these mid-ocean ridges, which are actually a volcano too, remember, or you had earthquakes at these trenches that lay near chains of volcanoes. So like Chile, for example, there is a trench off the coast of Chile, there's volcanoes in Chile, and you get earthquakes in Chile all the time. Those are all related. The areas with active volcanism and with big earthquakes turned out to be the plate boundaries by and large. You'll notice there's a couple of earthquakes in the middle, and there is something called an intraplate earthquake that I'm not really going to have time to talk about. Those often form along dead faults, essentially. But these maps showed where the Earth was under stress, and where the Earth is under stress is where the plate boundaries are. Plate boundaries to a big extent equal stress. I will say earthquakes tend to be very small at the mid-ocean ridges because the crust is warm and not quite as brittle, and it's being pulled apart, so you get a lot of little earthquakes. You get really big earthquakes in places like subduction zones because you have cold oceanic crust grinding up against thick continental crust, and there's much more brittle resistance. And this is simply a same version of that, but just showing volcanoes instead. Now, notice something. There are some volcanoes in Antarctica, but they are not near a plate boundary. We will get to that. There are some rare exceptions where volcanoes do form somewhat independently of plate tectonics and plate boundaries, although they are still related in a very distal, abstract way. But that's for the second half of the lecture. The result of all of this is that we know that this is more or less what happened to the Atlantic. And one thing I love about this is that it actually shows movement of solid material in the mantle going in circles. In the second half of the lecture, we'll talk about how that's actually one of the things that drives plate tectonics. Convection in the mantle actually is kind of the engine that keeps the cycle running. But new oceanic crust formed between South America and Africa. You'll also notice that oceanic crust in the Pacific is disappearing. Oceanic crust in the Pacific is being subducted at a greater rate to make up for this. And indeed, presently, the Atlantic Ocean is getting larger, while the Pacific Ocean, which is mostly surrounded by trenches like in Japan, Off the coast of Alaska, Chile, New Zealand, the Pacific Ocean is getting smaller. That's also why it's called the Ring of Fire, all of the volcanoes and all of the earthquakes from all of those trenches surrounding it. That's it for half one. For the second half, I'm going to talk about the different types of plate boundaries. We've already talked about how you have volcanoes at subduction zones and volcanoes at mid-ocean ridges. Those are two different types of plate boundaries, and it turns out how the volcanoes get made is actually kind of different, which is cool. All right, on to the lecture 2B coming up next.